It was the 28th of March, in the year 1937, Easter Sunday. The spring air hung cold over Manhattan's Turtle Bay neighborhood, where the fashionable district of Beekman Place rose along the East River. In those desperate years of the Great Depression, families sought what comfort they might find in the observance of holy days. The city's tenements and boarding houses stood crowded with immigrants and working folk, each scraping together what living they could manage. At number 316 East 50th Street, a modest apartment building sheltered several families. Upon the fifth floor resided Mrs. Mary Gedeon, a woman of 54 years who had come to America from Hungary 3 decades prior. She kept a respectable boarding house, letting rooms to supplement her modest means. With her lived her younger daughter, Veronica, a young woman of 20 years who had found employment as a commercial model. The apartment smelled of cooking and coal smoke, as did all such dwellings. The sounds of the city drifted through the windows, horse hooves upon cobblestones, the distant factory whistles, the church bells marking the sacred day. Joseph Gedeon, estranged from his wife these several years, arrived at the building carrying white lilies. He pressed the bell. No answer came. What awaited him beyond that door would soon grip the nation in horror. Veronica Jedian was born in the year 1917 in Astoria, a neighborhood within the borough of Queens. She was the younger daughter of Joseph and Mary Gedeon, Hungarian immigrants who had arrived in America during the Great Wave of 1897. Her elder sister Ethel preceded her into the world. The Gedeon family dwelt in modest circumstances, as did so many who had crossed the Atlantic seeking opportunity. The child attended William Cullen Bryant High School, where she completed her studies. She grew into a woman of notable beauty, possessing features that drew the attention of photographers and artists. Upon finishing her education, Veronica sought employment as a model. She posed not for the fashion houses of Fifth Avenue, but rather for the detective magazines and pulp periodicals that lined the newsstands. Publications such as Inside Detective and Headquarters Detective featured her image upon their covers. Photographs showed her in dramatic poses, bound, threatened, imperiled, the lurid illustrations that sold copies to working men across the city. When her likeness graced the front page, the magazines would often sell out their print runs entirely. The work was considered somewhat scandalous by respectable society. A young woman who appeared thus in photographs, however modest by modern standards, was sometimes regarded as possessing questionable moral character. Yet Veronica pursued her profession with determination, earning enough to contribute to the household's meagre funds. Her parents' marriage had dissolved some years prior to these events. The divorce left both Joseph and Mary struggling financially, though they maintained civil relations for the sake of their daughters. Mary Gedeon established herself as the keeper of a boarding house, first operating several establishments during the latter years of Prohibition, and finally settling into the apartments at 316 East 50th Street. It was said that she had once kept speakeasies during those lawless times, though such matters were no longer spoken of in respectable company. Ethel, the elder daughter, had recently married a gentleman named Joseph Kudner. Veronica remained with her mother, sharing the apartments alongside the various lodgers who came and went. Among these was Frank Burns, an Englishman of 35 years, who worked as a waiter. Mr. Burns had lost much of his hearing and found employment difficult to secure. Nevertheless, he paid his rent punctually and kept to himself in his chamber. The year 1937 found the nation still gripped by economic hardship. Industrial production faltered, working hours decreased. Families survived as best they could. Among the lodgers who had once resided with the Gedeon family was a young sculptor by the name of Robert George Irwin. He was born on the 5th of August in the year 1907 near Pasadena in California. His upbringing had been marked by hardship and instability. The father abandoned the family when Robert was but 3 years of age, leaving them in dire poverty. The boy spent time in a state reformatory, where he learned his trade. Robert possessed considerable artistic talent. He had worked for a waxwork company in Los Angeles, carving commercial busts of President Roosevelt and other notable figures. Later, he moved to New York to pursue his passions. He studied under accomplished masters, including the sculptor Lorado Taft, in whose household he resided for a time. Yet alongside his artistic gifts, Robert exhibited disturbing behaviors. He was considered erratic, prone to violent outbursts. He had once attempted self-mutilation with a razor, an act that resulted in his admission to a state mental hospital. Upon his release, he took lodgings at Mrs. Gedeon's establishment. There he encountered Ethel, the elder daughter. He developed an obsession with her, though she returned none of his affection. His infatuation grew into something darker. He spoke of creating sculptures, of capturing essence, of achieving spiritual union through his art. Ethel found his attentions disturbing and unwelcome. Robert was subsequently admitted to Rockland State Hospital in Orangeburg, New York, where he received treatment for 2 years before being released in the summer of 1936. By this time, Ethel had married. Robert, upon learning of her marriage, crafted a sculpture of her with a cobra coiled about her neck, a telling expression of his state of mind. He enrolled as a student at the Theological School of St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. Yet even there, his instability manifested. On the 18th of March, 1937, 10 days before Easter, he was expelled from the institution. The authorities cited his mental condition as grounds for dismissal. Robert then returned to New York City. He rented a room for a single day in a house upon 52nd Street, mere blocks from Mrs. Gedeon's boarding house. He was observed near the East River, where a concerned citizen spoke with him after he expressed intentions to drown himself. Later that same day, witnesses reported seeing him walking near the building on East 50th Street. Evening fell. The holy day approached. What thoughts occupied his troubled mind, none could say with certainty. Joseph Gedeon arrived at the building shortly after midday on Easter Sunday. He carried the white lilies, intending them as a gesture of goodwill. Though separated from his wife, he had agreed to join the family for holiday dinner. He pressed the bell to the apartments. No response came. He waited, presuming some difficulty with the mechanism. Soon after, his daughter Ethel arrived with her husband, Joseph Kudner. They too pressed the bell. Still no answer. Growing concerned, they sought out the building's superintendent, who permitted them entry. They climbed to the 5th floor. The door to the apartment stood slightly ajar. Joseph entered first. The parlor appeared undisturbed. The kitchen showed no signs of preparation for the expected meal. He called out. Silence answered. He proceeded toward the bedchambers. In Veronica's room, he discovered his younger daughter lying upon the bed. Her clothing was disarranged. She did not move. He perceived immediately that she was beyond all earthly aid. He turned next to his wife's chamber. It too appeared empty at first glance. Mary's small dog, a Pekingese named Tucci, whined and cowered beneath Veronica's bed. When Joseph attempted to retrieve the animal, it lunged forth and snapped at him. Peering beneath the bed, he discovered Mary's body concealed there. She, too, had been killed. A third chamber housed the lodger, Mr. Frank Burns. Joseph found him lying in his bed, motionless. He had been stabbed multiple times. The police were summoned immediately. Officers from the 17th Precinct responded within the hour. They examined the scene with professional detachment. 3 persons lay dead. The door had been left partially opened. An upstairs neighbour, one Charles Robinson, reported that he had noticed the door standing ajar at approximately 2:30 that morning, and had closed it, thinking little of the matter at the time. Investigation revealed that Veronica had returned to the apartments at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning. She had been intoxicated, returning from an evening engagement. The constabulary determined that Mrs. Gedeon and Mr. Burns had likely been killed before Veronica's arrival. The murderer had waited for her return. Medical examination was ordered. The bodies were removed to the morgue. Evidence was collected and catalogued. Witness statements were recorded. The newspapers, learning of the crime, descended upon Beekman Place like carrion birds. By evening, the story dominated the front pages. 3 dead, a beautiful young model, a mystery that would consume the city. The post-mortem examinations were conducted by the city medical examiner. Both Mrs. Mary Gedeon and her daughter Veronica had been strangled. Mrs. Gedeon bore additional injuries. She had been stabbed as well. The examination revealed defensive wounds upon her hands, suggesting she had struggled against her assailant. Mr. Frank Burns had sustained 11 wounds from a sharp, thin implement, an ice pick or similar instrument, driven through his skull into the brain. The weapon was never recovered. The medical examiner determined that Mr. Burns had likely been killed whilst he slept. His deafness meant he would not have heard the earlier violence in the apartments. The time of death for all 3 victims was estimated to have occurred between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning. Forensic examination of the scene revealed several curious items. Upon the floor lay a sculpture carefully carved from ordinary bath soap. The work demonstrated considerable skill. Additionally, strands of grey hair were discovered clutched in Veronica's hand, suggesting she had grasped her attacker during the struggle. The partially disrobed state of both women initially led investigators to consider the possibility of criminal assault. However, medical examination found no evidence to support such a conclusion. The exact circumstances remained unclear. An alarm clock was noted as missing from the apartments. Other personal items appeared undisturbed. The family's small dog had barked at no one during the night, a circumstance suggesting the perpetrator was known to the household. Detective attention turned first to a young man who had occasionally served as driver for the family. However, his movements were accounted for. Next, they questioned Mr. Joseph Gedeon himself. His reaction to the discovery had been noted as remarkably composed. Yet, investigation revealed he possessed a sound alibi. His religious convictions were known, and whilst he disapproved of his younger daughter's profession, nothing connected him to the crime. If you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let's continue. By the 7th of April, police attention had shifted toward a former lodger. The soap sculpture suggested an artist's hand. Officers recalled a sculptor named Robert George Irwin, who had once boarded with the family. He had been dismissed from Mrs. Gedeon's establishment after developing an unwelcome fascination with the elder daughter, Ethel. His history of mental instability was known. A warrant was issued. His photograph was distributed throughout the city and beyond. A nationwide search commenced, the largest manhunt since the Lindbergh kidnapping 5 years prior. Yet Robert Irwin had vanished entirely. The constabulary feared he had already fled the state. The search for Robert Irwin continued for nearly 3 months. His photograph appeared in newspapers and periodicals across the nation. In late June, a chambermaid at the Statler Hotel in Cleveland, Ohio, observed a resemblance between a barboy named Bob Murray and the wanted man whose image had appeared in True Detective Mysteries. When she questioned him about Robert Irwin, the young man cleaned out his locker and disappeared. The manhunt intensified. Robert fled to Chicago. There, he contacted the Chicago Tribune by telephone, offering to surrender for a price. The newspaper dismissed the call as a prank. He then contacted the Chicago Herald-Examiner, a publication owned by William Randolph Hearst. This newspaper took the matter seriously. They negotiated an arrangement whereby Robert would receive $5,000 and a new suit of white linen in exchange for his exclusive confession, after which he would surrender to authorities. Robert arrived at the newspaper offices. He provided his account to the city editor. The confession was published in sensational installments. He explained that he had gone to the Gedeon apartments seeking Ethel, intending to kill her because she was, in his words, the dearest object in the world to him. He wished to behead her and create a death mask. Finding her absent, he had conversed with Mrs. Gedeon, who asked him to leave. This request enraged him. He strangled and stabbed her. When Veronica arrived home and spoke his name, he strangled her also, fearing she would identify him. He then killed Mr. Burns to eliminate a potential witness, unaware that the man's deafness meant he had heard nothing. Following his confession, Robert was placed aboard an aeroplane and flown to New York, where police took him into custody on the 26th of June, 1937. The trial commenced in the autumn of 1938. Public interest was extraordinary. One account reported that not since the Harry Thor murder trial had a case excited such widespread attention. The courtroom was thronged with spectators, many of them women eager to glimpse the accused. Yet soon after a jury was selected, Robert pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder. This plea was made in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, and for the peculiar promise that a pair of trousers he had abandoned in a suitcase at Grand Central Station would be returned to him. Judge James Wallace pronounced sentence: 139 years in prison. 99 years for the killing of Mr. Burns, 20 years for Mrs. Gedeon, and 20 years for Veronica. The verdict was received with satisfaction by the public. The newspapers, which had profited enormously from the sensational coverage, reported the sentence with bold headlines. Veronica's photographs, those same images that had once graced the covers of detective magazines, had kept the story upon the front pages for months. This publicity, ironically, had led directly to Robert's capture, when the chambermaid in Cleveland recognized his face from True Detective Mysteries. Following sentencing, Robert was conveyed to Sing Sing prison for psychological examination. There, prison physicians evaluated his mental state and ruled him to be very definitely insane. On the 10th of December, 1938, he was transferred to Dannemora State Hospital. He was later moved to Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane in Fishkill, New York, where he remained for the duration of his natural life. The case prompted significant changes in the state of New York. Legislative hearings investigated the treatment of persons suffering from mental disorders. The repeated failures to adequately assess and contain Robert Irwin, despite his voluntary admissions to institutions, his documented history of violence, and his own expressed concerns about his condition, exposed grave deficiencies in the psychiatric system. Several hospital administrators lost their positions for having released him despite clear warning signs. New protocols were established for the evaluation of potentially dangerous patients. Stricter policies regarding release and supervision were enacted. The case also drew attention to the systematic exclusion of women from juries in first-degree murder trials. On the eve of the initial trial date, the acting commissioner of jurors announced that none of the 841 names of potential jurors in the selection drum was a woman, despite the enactment of statutes expressly allowing women to serve. One day following this announcement, the New York courts began placing women upon jury lists for such cases. The death of Veronica Gedeon thus contributed, in some small measure, to the advancement of women's participation in the administration of justice. Mrs. Mary Gedeon and her daughter Veronica were laid to rest in St. Mary's Cemetery in Yonkers. The exact location of Mr. Frank Burns's burial remains unrecorded in available sources. a final indignity for a man whose death was overshadowed by the sensational aspects of the case. Robert George Irwin died of cancer in 1975, having spent 37 years confined in institutions for the criminally insane. He was 67 years old. His confession, purchased by a newspaper for $5,000 and published in lurid installments, had nearly secured his execution by electric chair. The paid confession became a symbol of journalistic excess in an era already noted for sensationalism. The apartments at 316 East 50th Street still stand today, though the neighborhood has changed beyond recognition. The Great Depression has passed into history. The newspapers that once trumpeted the Easter Sunday murders have folded or transformed. Yet in the archives, the case files remain, testimony to a tragedy born of obsession, mental illness, and a society ill-equipped to address either. Years passed. The names faded from memory. Only the dusty files remain, recording what transpired on that cold Easter morning when 3 lives were taken in the darkness before dawn.